And we are live on both YouTube and Facebook. Welcome everyone to Greatest Generation Live, our VBC's first Greatest Generation of 2022. My name is Sean Hall, the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We'll be getting started here in just a few minutes with several guests to tell some pretty incredible stories we have. So sit back and enjoy. And if you'd like to leave a comment on either platform, YouTube or Facebook, we will be scoping those out and making sure that we can bring them into the live program. Thank you all for coming and being a part of this.
Carole, I'm going to ask you to sort of introduce yourself in terms of your background. I have a little bit of background here for Greg and David, but I've just always known you for the past couple of years as Carole. So
that's fine with me. But as to my background, I got connected to the Veterans Breakfast Club kind of through a back door. I was a history major for my undergrad and graduate studies, but it was my late husband who was the military historian in the family. And there isn't a Civil War battlefield that we haven't visited. Gettysburg many, many times. I think we know every blade of grass by name down there. So I gained some knowledge and some interest in military history from hanging out with my late husband. But I'm also the daughter of a World War II vet, the niece of many, many World War II vets, the cousin of World War II vets. And so I've taken a particular interest in World War II. One of the last things my husband was doing was creating the oral history of all of our friends and relatives who fought in World War II. And I've been trying to go through those tapes and clean them up and annotate them and probably ultimately, deliver them to Veterans Archives. But in the meantime, and clean them up and annotate them. Okay. I found the Veterans Breakfast Club and have been hanging out with you folks since then.
Sean, are you ready to go live on Zoom yet?
Oh, you are itching tonight, Glenn. I love it. I love the energy. You want to get, it's like, Johnny, before going out, it's like, let's do this. Let's go. Come on. Give you another minute here. And
another minute.
We will.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry I cut you short, Carole. I thought we were about ready to go.
Give you the 60-second countdown. We'll start a touch early. I was making sure I can view on both of the streaming platforms so that let's see here, so that I can capture any comments that might be made on either one.
Great. You're flying solo tonight. No Ellie either.
Yeah, no, I said, hey, I got this one. I think I can handle it. We'll see. We'll see. I might.
Time will tell, Sean.
That's true. It's always a roll of the dice.
Hey, I just clocked in here because I got I
think I can handle it. Hi, Todd.
Hey.
We'll see. I might.
Time will tell.
We're just about ready to go live.
Hey, I got a text from Chris Crompton saying she's trying to get in and she can't.
Oh, that's because we hadn't started yet, but I will let her in.
Oh, yeah. She wanted to come in. Glenn told her it should be in early.
Oh, my apologies. Here we are.
All right.
I'm sorry. I forgot as well. My fault.
Hi, Chris. Good evening.
You're muted, Chris.
How are you?
Hi, Chris.
Good evening. All right, we'll get going here. I'm going to share my sound and we'll let everybody into the room. Let's do it. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club Greatest Generation Live for Tuesday, January 18th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming here with the VBC. And you may notice that Todd is not here tonight, the Executive Director, Todd DiPastino, flying. I'm taking the con. I always like to use that line because I know I'm not the biggest Star Trek fan. I think that everybody knows that line. It's so great. We got a really, really exciting program lined up for everyone tonight. Flickinger's gonna lead us through that in just a minute. I have just a couple announcements before we get started. I'm gonna share my screen here and show a couple of the upcoming events that we have coming up with VBC. We got some good stuff. It's kind of incredible that we've sort of hit the ground running as fast as we are, because it's like the new year hit and suddenly it was just like, you know what, let's throw out the best stuff that we can. Let me make sure I'm getting on the right page there. Here we are. Okay. So tonight we have Flying with the 15th Air Force, several different stories to get through this evening. We'll get to them very shortly. Coming up tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Eastern time, is Joe Tedeschi. He wrote A Rock in the Clouds. He is the survivor of a plane crash. I'm going to be hosting this program and talking with Joe about his service and this story. I mean, like the one thing that you asked to start is, what happens when you survive a plane crash? And I think he's been trying to answer that question his whole life. What do I do now? A really interesting conversation coming up tomorrow morning. And we have Saturday, our first members only event. That'll be Saturday night, 7 p.m. Jeopardy! I will be playing the role of Alex Trebek. Todd DiPastino will be on to get conversation going. We got a lot of good trivia for that night. We have 3 teams of 3 going up against each other, non-veterans, teenagers, and veterans. Who's going to come out on top? If you're not a member yet, come to our website. Join us. It's $36 a year. You get free magazine 4 times a year. You get a whole bunch of different perks. So check that out. And then Monday night, next week, 7 p.m. Eastern time, will be the Pueblo Crisis 1968. We will have on some of the Pueblo veterans coming on to talk about the crisis. And also we have the podcast that I host called The Scuttlebutt. That came out this past Monday. And I don't know if anyone on here has heard about military fraternities, but it's the first time that I had heard of one. And we were contacted by Mu Beta Phi, and they said, hey, we'd love to come on and talk about our fraternity. Well, they've had a lot of success in a very short amount of time. And we've had a really great conversation with one of their co-founders and another one of their members. It's very interesting. And I've learned a lot about military fraternities. So if you want to check that out, you can go to our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org, and check out the podcast. You can watch it on YouTube. You can download it wherever you get your audio podcasts and listen to it on the way into work. But otherwise, that's all the announcements that I have. Glenn, are you excited about tonight?
I am excited about tonight. Yes, very. Thank you very much for that great introduction. And we've been working on this, at least Carole and I have been working on this for a year, 18 months.
Almost a year.
On her part of this anyway. So finally, we've got to the red zone here. We're about to score here, Carole. Sure. Tonight, the program is about the 15th Air Force, the Forgotten Air Force. And we have several guests that I'm going to introduce to you now. And I'm going to give up front just a little background on the 15th Air Force. So with us tonight, well, I'll start with Carole, since we already addressed that. Carole Popchock, longtime member of the Veterans Breakfast Club. And Carole, give us a little bit about your history background, just 30 seconds, if you would.
History major for my bachelor's and my master's, but not a military historian. I learned a little bit about military history through my late husband. And as he was chronicling the oral histories of World War II veterans among our family and friends, I became that much more interested in that side of our family story. So I am now carrying on his work and doing a little bit more to curate the interviews he's already collected.
Okay, great. Welcome. Thank you for all the research you've done on this topic tonight. We also have Dr. David Snead on the program tonight. David, say hello, please.
Hello, all. I appreciate you inviting me on. I'm excited to be here to talk about the Forgotten 15th.
And we found, David, if I could just call you that for short, David.
Yes, please.
A book that he edited with a 15th Air Force veteran, Tom Faulkner, Flying with the 15th Air Force. And that's a book that Carole and I had found and read, and I just Googled David, found his contact information at Liberty College, and he's been kind enough to join us tonight for the program. We had hoped to have Tom Faulkner himself. He's still alive, 97, I think, David?
96, almost 97.
Almost 97. But he's just not able to be on tonight. Bit of a health issue, COVID issue, that sort of thing. David is a full professor at Liberty College and has been a history professor there, and I guess head of the history department at one time there, David, for 20 plus years, written several books and edited several books.
Yes.
So we're pleased to have you, David.
Thank you.
And then also with us tonight is Greg Bozek and his sister, Chris Compton. So they are the son and daughter of John Bozek, who is also a 15th Air Force veteran, a navigator, and is still with us. Also 97? 97, okay. Both these men are quite young when they served in the 15th Air Force. And Greg is going to do the speaking for the family. He has a nice archive of pictures, which photos and background on his father. And quite interesting, I didn't discover this until yesterday. Greg is a 1979 graduate of West Point. Commissioned as an Army officer, served many years along the east-west German border with the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, graduate of the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies, served as an Army planner with the Mechanized Infantry Division and with the Army Staff and Joint Staff in D.C., currently lives in Savannah, Georgia. So, although not a military historian, certainly a military man. Thank you for your service, Greg.
Thank you.
Okay. And Chris, just say hello, please, as the other sibling in this pair.
Hello, longtime friend of the Veterans Breakfast Club, so it's nice to be here.
And a former, one of the original board of directors of the club, is that right?
Correct. I was the president of the Veterans Breakfast Club for the first 6 years, just keeping the seat warm for the next person.
Great, great. And then just one last person I'd like to recognize, if they're on, would the son and daughter of Captain Lloyd Starkweather from the 15th Air Force, are they on the program now? I think that's Joanne and Lee. Would they speak up perhaps? No? Okay. A friend of ours, Jeff Ballard, out in California, put us in touch with them just today and recommended they be on the program, but they're not here. Their father served with the 15th Air Force as well. So, okay. So let me do a very quick introduction of the 15th Air Force. So I'm going to take the screen, I hope here, Sean, and show you.
Yeah, you are co-host, so you should be able to share screen.
Okay. Okay, let me get this teed up. There we go. So, you seen that okay, Sean?
I am.
Okay, 15th Air Force. Look like my graphics are just a little off there, but basically, these are the three veterans we're talking about tonight: Tom Faulkner, John Bozek, and Frank Ladisick. Do I have that pronunciation right, Carole?
That's correct.
Okay. And we're going to learn all about them here in the next hour or so. So, Greg Bozek, you might recognize this map because I stole it from you.
No problem.
I was an English major and undergraduate, and I am really, really good at plagiarism. The reason I stole this from Greg, because he's going to show it a little bit later too, is this is obviously Italy, right? This is Foggia right here, where the 15th Air Force flew out of. And I learned from Greg, the first time I ever understood that there was another base down here in the toe of Italy called Manduria. And that's where his father, John Bozek, flew out of, okay? So what I always like to point out about the Italian campaign, we invaded Italy in September of 1943 here at Salerno, where I'm putting my cursor, right? We also, the British actually came across down below from Sicily, and also there was an operation coming up the heel. So, you know, we invaded in 1943. The whole Italian campaign is a much debated campaign of World War II. We're not going to get into that. But one of the basic reasons we invaded Italy was to take southern Italy so we could get these Air Force bases, right? It's also one of the reasons that the Nazis defended Italy. Originally, Hitler didn't want to defend Italy, but his field marshal there, Marshal Albert Kesselring, convinced him to defend Italy because Kesselring was an Air Force general and understood the strategic importance of these air bases, okay? So that's how all this developed. Foggia is a plain here where there's lots of room for Air Force bases. If you can see this, this is the symbol of the 15th Air Force. And this was mostly the radius of the operations of the 15th Air Force, right? They did go up to Berlin up here once in March, I think, of 45. But for the most part, it was Southern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and most importantly, or as importantly as any place else, the oil fields in Romania, okay? Next quick slide here. I get to show every time I chance I get, because he's my favorite World War II general, General Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle was actually the first commander of the 15th Air Force. 15th Air Force created in November of 43, actually started operations from North Africa, where Doolittle already was located. And they really didn't open the airfields at Foggia until David, January, February of 44?
January of 44.
44, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And by that time, Doolittle had actually already left the 15th Air Force. He was really only the commander for the first, 6-7 weeks. And the command moved over to another well-known Air Force general, General Nathan Twining, I think it is, if I have that pronunciation right, okay. And then there were several other commanders. This is the best map I could find that shows the Fojia Airfields right there on the Adriatic coast. I never learned until a couple of years ago in reading that Foggia was actually many airfields in this general area that I'm circling here. I think by the end of the war, 20 plus airfields, both for bomber groups and fighter groups, okay? Just a few pictures. I mean, David will tell you more about this perhaps. It was not a pretty place. And the odd thing is, one of the reasons they wanted to operate out of Foggia was that they thought the weather would be better than it was in England, where the 8th Air Force was based. Turned out not to be the case. Just as bad, just as miserable, maybe a little warmer, although sometimes you could probably argue that in January and February, than the 8th Air Force in England. This is actually a B-24 taxiing towards takeoff. Almost looks like some sort of seaborne plane, right? This is how tough the conditions were there, right? This is a fighter group that a fighter plane taking off from one of the fighter fields. Another, just a picture of the logistics there. Again, just a sort of a sea of mud, a great deal of the time. Very difficult to operate out of, and very difficult place to live in as well. And this, I just want to remind you, last year, one of my favorite interviews last year was this man with his 3 fingers up, Colonel Harry Stewart, who was a P-51 pilot at 19 years old for the Tuskegee Airmen, and the Tuskegee Airmen flew out of Fojia. Okay. So that's just a little bit of background. The others are going to be giving a lot more detailed information than me. One of the little things I wanted to share, though, is the size of the 15th Air Force. It by its peak towards the end of the war, it was about half the size of the 8th Air Force. Little statistics here, David, I hope these are right. The 8th Air Force had 41 bomb groups, the 15th Air Force, 21. The 8th Air Force, 15 fighter groups, the 15th Air Force, 7. And if I did my arithmetic right, that translated into, for the 15th Air Force, about 1,850 bombers and 650 fighters, right? So quite a huge operation, but only about half the size of the 8th Air Force. David, any of that, you would want to add anything there about the background of the 15th Air Force?
And that sounds about right size-wise. You got to remember the 8th Air Force has a longer history, having started much earlier in the war. But what the 15th Air Force did, and you showed it in your pictures, was it opened up parts of Nazi-occupied Europe that the 8th Air Force could not reach.
Right.
And so that was a critical thing about taking Italy and setting up the Air Force there. It put the airfields in Romania within range for bombing attacks. It put parts of southern Germany in range of bombing attacks that weren't accessible for the 8th Air Force.
Right, right. Okay. So Greg or Carole, anything you want to add on the background of the 15th Air Force?
No, I think it'll be fun talking about our respective parts. I look forward to it.
Okay. Well, we're going to jump right to Carole then. Carole, and I think, Sean, you're going to tee up Carole's slides. Is that correct? Great.
Yes. You will note that Glenn got the pronunciation of Latisic correct, but he didn't get the spelling correct.
Oh.
It ends in C, but you were close enough, Glenn, and phonetically you were right on the money. This is one of only 2 pictures I have of my cousin Frank. And the impetus for this program actually began from some conversation on a VBC show. I think it was last spring where the mention of the Ploesti raids came up. And I seem to recall a family story about someone who had been in the war and who had flown in those raids. So I asked around the family and was reminded of our maternal grandmother's story that our dad's first cousin, Frank Latisic, was a World War II pilot. And the reason that it had come down from my maternal grandmother was that her family, my father's family, Frank's family, they all knew each other in the Croatian Fraternal Union here in Pittsburgh and had connections that way. My dad's mother and Frank's mother were sisters. And so these families all knew each other, and my grandmother knew a lot about what had happened to Frank from conversing, obviously, with his mother and other relatives. Frank was an only child. His father died in the 1918 flu pandemic when Frank was only an infant. And the story from my grandmother was that Frank was a pilot in World War II, that he was shot down over Yugoslavia in the Balkan raids, which is what the papers were calling them back home. And at the time, Yugoslav partisans were sheltering any downed Allied air crews that they could come upon. And because Frank spoke fluent Croatian, his mother, my great aunt, Anne, was never convinced that he was gone. She always believed that if he went down over Yugoslavia, he would have found a way to survive. And honestly, years and years after the war, great Aunt Anne still did not believe that her only child was dead. But what I didn't know was that we actually had 30 letters, not ready for the second slide yet, Sean. We actually had 30 letters that my cousin Frank had written to my mother before she was engaged to my father between April 1942 and April 1944. And these were the years and months that he was training to become a combat pilot. The other thing I didn't know was that there were conflicting accounts of what actually happened on his last mission of April 4th, 1944. There was a letter that was circulated by the co-pilot's father that seemed to echo what the War Department had said in their telegrams. They were shot down over Yugoslavia, returning from a mission, and crews on other planes saw people parachuting from Frank's plane, which was called the Hot Rock. So there was this hope hanging out there that there were survivors and that Frank might be one of them. But that came to a stop when I started doing deeper research to prepare for this ultimate program. On a website for the 15th Air Force, I found a spreadsheet for the 737th Squadron, of which Frank was a part. And there was just a snippet from a missing aircrew report, which had 8 really surprising words for me about the Hot Rock. Fate, shot down. Cause, accident. Target, practice. Nation, Italy, not Yugoslavia. Location, Adriatic practice mission. Well, you can imagine my surprise because I had discovered a story about Frank that Frank's family and friends never knew. And obviously I wanted to know more, but all I had were the 30 letters. I'm still doing additional research, which has been slowed down a little bit by COVID and availability of people and resources. But I thought what I could share with you tonight are some glimpses of the life of a combat pilot in training, because that's what Frank's letters are all about. So here he is as a 24-year-old entering the service in April of 1942. At the time, he was a sophomore at Slippery Rock State Teachers College studying to be a teacher. But over the next 20 months, if you'll pull up that next slide now, Sean, Frank left his North Side Pittsburgh roots and traveled quite a bit in the United States to become a pilot. His 7 stops took him first to San Antonio, Texas, then Pine Bluff, Arkansas, then Waco, Texas, then Tucson, Arizona, then Orlando, Florida, then McCook, Nebraska, which ironically he compared to Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and then finally New York City on his way to Foggia, Italy, and the San Giovanni Air Base. Now, in all of those stops, Frank had lots of comments about the geography, the culture, the music, and the weather, which I guess pilots focus on a lot. So what I'd like to do is just share some of this stuff that I learned from the letters with you, with some excerpts from some of his letters and some of the ephemera that he sent to my mother. The next slide shows you a newsletter from one of Frank's first air bases. The newsletter is called The Tailspinner. And I'm going to read you the article in the lower left corner. It's called 43D Arrives, You Lucky Girls. 43D was Frank's class, 1943 4th Pilot Training Group, letter D. The article reads, "Hello, girls, here we are. We are 43D, the cockiest, rootin' tootin'est, handsomest, wisecracking, happiest bunch of pilot yearlings you've ever seen in these Texas woods. We'll make 43C and all our predecessors look like a pack of Texas jackrabbits hightailing it from a San Antonio hurricane. We'll live up to everything you thought they were going to be, and then some. We've bucked the noon crowds in a Bronx subway. We've survived the bargain sales at Macy's basement, and we've been bold enough to cheer for the Giants in Ebbets Field. So girls, nothing is going to stop us now. The line forms on the right. Here's hoping no girls get killed in the stampede. 43D has arrived." Editor's note, any resemblance to 43D's idea of what charms they may possess and the resulting picture of them 9.5 weeks from now is purely coincidental. There's a lot of confidence expressed in that little article in the newsletter, but I don't see a lot of that confidence in the early letters that my cousin writes. But there was also, and I'll share some of that with you in a moment, but there was also a little humor I wanted to share with you. In the next slide, Sean, you'll see one of the cartoons that appeared in the newsletter. And it speaks to this new code that they're learning how to adapt to, the code of discipline and strict policy and procedures. And in this cartoon, you can see the cadets are making the point that even when you're asleep, you're expected to be at attention. Well, Frank had something to say about these policies and procedures in a letter that he sent my mother in October of 1942. Everything we do has a definite procedure and we must follow it to the letter. In short, it's strict discipline, and I mean strict. There are only 3 answers we can give: yes, sir, no, sir, and no excuse, sir. Lots of times you'd like to explain why you did something, but you can't do it, so it's no excuse, sir. And he goes on to explain, when more than one fellow is walking anywhere, they must walk in step, and only 2 fellows are permitted to walk side by side. Another thing cadets aren't allowed to do is put their hands in their pockets. A fellow reached into his pocket in town one day, and an MP reminded him about it. If we reach for our money, we do it quickly, so it doesn't attract attention. Now, this is my favorite part of the letter. A cadet doesn't drink, but when he does, he never gets drunk. And when he does, he doesn't stagger. When he staggers, he never falls. And when he falls with his face in the gutter so no one will recognize him. I'd call that adapting to military life. There's another cartoon that appears in a separate newsletter from another base that Frank sent. And that's on the next slide, Sean. This addresses what I found to be an undercurrent in a lot of Frank's letters, this nagging fear that I'm not good enough, I'm not going to make it. Hondo, I think, refers to Hondo Air Base in Texas, where you were sent to learn how to be a navigator. I'm surmising, and I'm sure Air Force people will correct me if I'm wrong, that if you washed out as a pilot, your next stop might have been Hondo Base to see if you could make it as a navigator. So Frank has penciled in on the margin there, place where washouts go. And I think we can assume from that it's not a place they wanted to go. But Frank had several letters where he speaks to some of his fears about not being able to make the grade. And I'll share just a few excerpts from those. Our class has become quite small. This is from November of 1942. Every day we lose a couple, and that only helps to keep us on edge. There were 320 of us when we came here. Now we have about 120. Wonder how many will actually finish here. The old class left for basic training, and a new bunch of dodos have arrived, so that makes me an upperclassman. Bad weather put us behind in our flying, so this weekend we didn't get open post. I flew all day Sunday, and say I wasn't tired and dirty, I looked and felt like an old mop. If everything goes well, I should finish here in about 4 weeks, then to basic. So there I go daydreaming. Classes had been easy until now. Don't know how hard meteorology and navigation will be. I finished courses in engines and theory of flight, also called theory of fright. That constant fear of washing out was also echoed in a comment that Frank made about instrument flying, which it turns out would become extremely important in the time of the war that Frank was flying. As you have seen in some of the pictures, the weather conditions were horrible. And many missions, had to turn around because of bad weather conditions. And instrument flying was something that American pilots were excelling at in 1944 that their German counterparts were not. So it turned out to be a strategic advantage and well worth the time to go through this training. But Frank says this, as for instrument flying, let's just say it's confusing. When that hood is over you, your imagination plays the damnedest tricks on you. The whole idea is to keep all the instruments where you want them. It's hard to believe the instruments, but you've just got to, or else. For fun and thrills, I'll take formation, but it's a constant job to stay in position. So Frank was certainly finding instrument flying and other parts of pilot training a challenge. But his fears were sort of ungrounded because he not only overcame his fears, but he did make the grade. And on the next slide, I found a surprising piece of ephemera among the things he sent my mother. A very formal, I hope you can see it on the left there, embossed invitation to the 43D graduation. I don't think any relatives were able to make it down to this graduation ceremony, but I was actually kind of surprised to see that there were formal graduation ceremonies of any kind in time of war. And maybe some of the other World War II vets can comment on things like that. So not only did Frank not wash out, but he actually became an instructor of other pilots when he moved on to advanced training. And I did run across one or two citations from people who trained with Frank and who commented on what a great teacher he was. And in one letter, Frank notes to my mother that when he's a pilot instructor, he tries not to go too hard on the guys because they get enough of that from the higher brass. And so he's trying to teach them gently as he can. You'll notice in this next slide that when you go to advanced pilot training, the stationery improves too. It goes from plain blank paper to this rather decorative piece of stationery. And I was intrigued by it because it seems to display all the aircraft that the Air Force might have been flying at that time. Everything from the B-17 in the 12 o'clock high position to their fighters and their scout planes and their interceptors. It's kind of an interesting piece of ephemera. But it also shows, I think, the pilot pride. You know, this is what we can handle, and we're on our way. On Frank's 25th birthday, October 5th, 1943, he got his assignment to the 454th Bomb Group and the 737th Squadron. And on the next slide, you'll see where they fit into the 15th Air Force. If you see my red circle down there on the right-hand side, that's the 454th Bomb Group. That's not only Frank's group, but as you're going to find out, it's also Tom Faulkner's. And if you want to know where the Tuskegee Airmen are, draw a diagonal line up a little bit to the right. And on the far right, you'll see the 332nd Fighter Wing right there. And those were the Tuskegee Airmen. So this is where Frank's group fits into the whole scheme of the 15th Air Force. As Glenn pointed out, under the command of Major General Nathan Farragut Twining, or Twinning, however that's pronounced. From everything that I have come across, the Hot Rock crew, Frank's crew, were considered a model crew. They did a lot of training of other crews. And I thought I would show you at least some of the crew with the only other picture I have of Frank on the next slide, Sean. This is the officers of the Hot Rock. My cousin Frank is on the far left, and then his co-pilot, Ralph Jones, his navigator at the time, James Brothers, and the bombardier, Alan Jordan. I say navigator at the time because by the time they got to Italy, Brothers apparently was doing such a good job that he was pulled in to be the squadron navigator, and a new navigator was sent to the Hot Rock for most of their missions in the Mediterranean campaign. So this crew of the Hot Rock in the winter of 1944, in some of the most horrendous weather conditions, flew about 20 missions. And they were credited with taking down 3 Nazi fighters along the way. During this time, the last letter my mother had received from cousin Frank was in December when he was still stateside. No correspondence at all throughout the winter of 1944, and then came the last letters. And if you'll go to the next slide, Sean, rather. Frank's letter on the top there, the last letter my mother received, and the letter at the bottom was my mother's letter back to him. Frank wrote his letter 6 days before he was killed. It didn't arrive until the day that his mother received the telegram from the War Department telling her that he was missing. My mother didn't know this, of course, and she immediately responded to Frank's letter, having waited so long to receive one. When I found this pile of letters that my sister had so wisely saved, even though my mother had told her to get rid of them at one point, I discovered that my mother's letter was still sealed. When she got it back, and you can see it's marked with all the Army and Air Force notations that he's missing, she just put it in the pile and never touched it again. So I opened it, and what I'd like to share with you from these last letters is Frank's comments about what's happening at the time and questions he has about the folks on the home front and how they're handling all the news. So first we'll hear from Frank. This is dated March 29th, 1944. Dear Anne, can't remember when I wrote you last or when I heard from you, but it sure has been a long time, and I'm sorry. I haven't any excuse that would satisfy you or anyone, so I'll not try to use one. I'm now in Italy after quite a trip over. Stopped at various places for different lengths of time, and it really was an education. Italy, as you no doubt have already heard, isn't the picturesque and romantic place it's claimed to be. I've seen only slums and ragged people since I came here. They haven't a thing, and at the rate they're going, they never will have much. There's nothing like the good old States. We live in tents and use the usual mess kits, etc., but things are improving all the time. Our mess hall should be finished soon, I hope. Conditions here aren't too bad anymore, as we are constantly fixing things a little better. When we first came here, there was nothing except a place to land our plane, and even that wasn't so hot, as you've seen in some of Glenn's pictures. At present, however, it looks like someone actually lives around here. How's everyone at home? Fine, I hope. I also hope you folks aren't too mad at me for not writing. What's new these days? Well, I'm busy as the devil doing you know what, and so far, everything's fine. I'd give you some details if it was ethical, but since it's not, I'll have to be still for the time being at least. Although I censor my own mail, I have to be fair, so it's just as hard for me to write as I please as it is for the other fellows. Tell me, do you know what my mother thinks about this flying business? How does she feel about it? I have an idea she worries too much. Wish she wouldn't, because it doesn't help. Must stop. Got something to do. In fact, it's an order from the captain. So till next time, your poor correspondent, Frank. In his PS, he asks my mom to help connect him with his cousin, Tom, the guy who's going to become my dad. He believes that his cousin is still in Italy, which he's not. He's up in England training for D-Day. But Frank was hoping to maybe have a rendezvous in Fojia with him if that was at all possible. My mother's reply is written the day she gets Frank's letter. And I'm just going to read some excerpts from this. Dear Frank, I received your March 29th letter today, and since I'm the one who owes you a couple of letters, I'm answering promptly. Yes, I've known that you were in Italy, and believe me, I don't envy you. Your mother has managed to keep us posted on what you've been doing. So you see, we have been keeping track of you. Now that I've mentioned your mother, I may as well answer your question as to whether she worries a great deal about you. Yes, Frank, she very definitely does worry. She spent the evening with us on Friday and told us she hadn't had a letter from you in almost a month, and naturally was quite worried. I know just how she feels because I've had occasion to worry about someone in that way also. It's a pretty awful feeling. You know, you fellows experience the actual thing over there, but we people back here in the States can only imagine what you're going through. If you've ever had the occasion to let your imagination run away with you, you'll know what I mean when I say that sometimes imagination can be a heck of a sight worse than the actual thing. You can certainly dream up the gosh awfulest things. But don't tell your mother that I told you this. She may not like the idea. One more thing your mother told us was that she worries so much that she gets to a point where she can't even eat. That happens when she doesn't get a letter from you. So the only solution I can give you is that you write her often, even if it's just a few words. You'd be surprised how much that helps. But I guess your mother has written you and told you about Tommy and me. Tommy has asked me to accept a diamond ring. This was how I found out my mother was engaged. And we're making plans to get married one of these days in the not too distant future, we hope. So you see, things have been happening to me since I heard from you. Weren't you surprised to hear about Joe Cornick being killed in Italy, my dad's oldest brother? It's so hard to believe. I had a letter from Al, his younger brother, last week. He's been moved to another island again. We're spilling our love life on each other's shoulders. Al swears that if he ever gets home again for one day or 30, he's going to get married. There's going to be weddings galore after the darn war is over, or so it seems. What these letters said to me was that they were kind of a collection of all the tension and anxiety and even some resignation to, what can you do that the war brought, but also the hope, an expectation that they were, going to be weddings galore someday. And I noticed that at the top of my mother's letter, under the date, she had written in quotation marks, "One day nearer victory." I guess that's something that they used a lot in their salutations. So I want to pay tribute to the whole crew of the Hot Rock, and that's the last slide that I have to share with you, Sean, if you want to put that one up. I was able to find out the names of everybody on the crew, though not all their hometowns, but while that flashes up there for you to examine, I just want to talk a little bit about what the 454th accomplished and what I was left with after going through all these letters and my research. I didn't get a clear picture of any of Frank's experiences in combat because he couldn't talk about them, but I got an idea of what he was up to. Part of that came from a message that General Arnold sent to the 8th and 15th Air Forces on New Year's Eve in 1943. And these 2 points in particular: it is a conceded fact that Overlord and Anvil will not be possible unless the German Air Force is destroyed. Therefore, my personal message to you, this is a must, is to destroy the enemy Air Force wherever you find them, in the air, on the ground, and in the factories. Well, Glenn has shown you the map of what the target range was of the 454th and the 15th Air Force in general. And Frank's missions, as far as I've been able to detect, took him into all those countries: Italy, Yugoslavia, Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania. Targets including aerodromes, marshalling yards, railroad bridges, landing grounds, industrial centers, aircraft factories. And the results they got, while not completely taking out the fuel supplies of the German military, did have a kind of domino effect. They were able to significantly reduce the amount of oil available, which meant that the Luftwaffe had to reduce their training time. And they, by 1944, had cut their training time in half. Their fighters were now putting in about 111 hours over 8 months in training. And some pilots of fighters were arriving at their units with only 20 hours of flying in fighters. Compare that to US fighter pilots who at the same time were averaging 500 hours of training and usually more than 200 hours in fighters, with much better gunnery training and much better instrument flying training, something that surely made a difference in that theater of war. The personal story I took from this was that, what Frank and the 15th Air Force helped to do was make it safer for his cousin, my dad, to land on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, without the Luftwaffe being the menace they could have been. But I never really had a clear picture of Frank's combat experience until I bought this book, Tom Faulkner and David Snead's wonderful book. And to my surprise, discovered that not only did Tom Faulkner join the 454th Bomb Group that my cousin Frank was in, but he was also in the 737th Squadron, the identical group that my cousin Frank flew in. And he was on the identical air base, San Giovanni, near Fojia. To say that I got chills when I discovered that is an understatement. And as I introduce David and let him take it from here, I will tell you that it has meant the world to me to have Tom Faulkner's recollections added to the letters that Frank Ladisick left for us and his family. David, take it away.
Thank you, Carole. I appreciate that very much. And talking about chills, just listening to that made me reminisce about the stories that I heard from Tom, as well as some other pilots that I talked to. And so that was wonderful. And we do thank you for the work you're doing for your family, but for veterans in general to share that story. And it's kind of interesting. Several of the things you brought up are going to be part of my presentation. I decided to focus on kind of the unusual or things that aren't discussed a lot in terms of the war and the experience. And I think it plays very well into what you did in your map of showing where Frank had been and trained. Tom was almost all in Texas, except eventually going out to Nevada and I think Arizona. But the same type of, don't bounce from place to place, fear of washing out, all of that were part of what he experienced. So Sean, if you'll put up my first slide, I would appreciate it. And I'm just going to say it's been such a privilege for me to work with Tom over several years. It was almost by chance that we came together. And Tom,
sorry to interrupt you, David. I just wanted to quickly say that Glenn, Jeff Ballard is in the room. He is watching on the Facebook side, and he has a couple questions and comments we'll get to later in the program. David, I'm going to pull up your PowerPoint right now.
Thank you, Sean. And I was just going to say, it is my privilege really to work with Tom on this and to help him edit his memoir and get it published, so share the story. And to hear somebody like Carole explain that it had meant so much to her to help explain kind of her cousin's story. That's one of the reasons we as historians do these things. And so, again, it's been a real privilege for me to work with Tom for, again, many years. And I wish he could be here tonight, but just some logistical issues that it wasn't possible to work out. And as I noted, I'm just going to share some stories about Tom. If people are interested, they can see this is the cover of his book. On the slide announcing this particular broadcast was a picture of Tom and part of his training crew. So I hope it encourages you, because I think it's a fascinating story that he has to tell. And Sean, if you go to the next slide, I only have a couple of slides, but I want to focus on a few issues. The first issue I want to touch on, and I just have a title: Young Men Assume Grown-Up Roles. I know we know this. We've all studied World War II, read World War II. And it's just, these many cases were just young guys who are called to serve. And so I pulled up some pictures. A couple of these are in Tom's book. A couple are just others that I had that reflects this. On the far left, this is Tom as a 14-year-old. He was in the junior ROTC at his high school. He was a sophomore at this point. The picture at the bottom left was when he was on the football team. This is his senior year, and he would be young as a senior. He was 16 during football season. He graduated when he was 17. But this picture was actually taken right before Pearl Harbor. They played in the Texas playoffs on December 6th of 1941. He was hurt in the game, so he heard about the Pearl Harbor. A friend came by to see him and check on him and told him about that. So I tell this story. He's 16 years old, and he's got he's high school, but all of these teenagers, young adults like Frank that Carole talked about, Pearl Harbor changes things. It brings to reality that this war that's going on now will probably include them, whether they enlisted or were drafted. And Tom was one of those. Now, he had to finish high school. He's just a 16-year-old. But he finishes the next spring high school. So he graduates at 17. And a group of him and a couple of his friends decided to immediately start college. So they went to Texas A&M. They got into Texas A&M, and they started college in the summer, and they did the summer and the fall at Texas A&M. This is important to the story because he's still only 17, but he completed, in essence, a year of college between the summer and the fall semesters. And that was critical because for pilot training at the time, you had to have a year of school. Previously, it had been 2 years. So you had to have a year of training. And so he did that. Over Christmas, as a 17-year-old, he basically signed up for the Army Air Force for when he turned 18. He transferred to Southern Methodist University to be closer to home, kind of waiting for that. And literally about 3 weeks after his birthday in early March, he was enrolled into the Air Force. He was called into service. And so he began training as a pilot. So he's 18 in 3 months to begin training as a pilot. So kind of let that sink in. No idea at this stage he would be a bomber pilot or whatever, but he's brought in. One of the things that Tom never, we can't find out, I asked those who might know, is he thinks he might have been the youngest combat pilot, American combat pilot in the war. And it's very possible, just it's physically impossible age-wise to do this. It would have been difficult. So he began training, and 9 months later, Carole talks about 43D. He was, I guess, in 44A. He was in the first graduating class of 1944. So still 18 years old. He graduates, gets commissioned as a lieutenant. So he's an officer. He's going to begin advanced training. He ended up in the bomber training for 4-engine bombers. And so by the time he's 19, he is in command of a crew of 9 others, so 10 total. So he's in charge of them. He is the youngest guy there. His crew ranged from an age of 20 to 30, and he's in command of them. And so just a few years older, he was that little scrawny kid in ROTC uniform, and now he's commanding a U.S. bomber B-24 that's going to go in combat. And by September 1944 was when he arrived in Italy. He arrived in late August, but began flying missions in September. Again, tying it to Carole's presentation just a little bit, in the sacrifice that obviously Frank made, the ultimate sacrifice in his crew. Those missions in the spring were critical because one of their goals was basically to destroy the Luftwaffe. And they did. It affected D-Day. Luftwaffe didn't have much. Tom never saw a German fighter plane. Never saw one, at least in the air. He saw plenty of flak, but never a fighter plane. Without those efforts earlier that year, when that was the focus, destroy him in the air, destroy him on the ground, that couldn't have happened. And so young men, Tom in this case, Frank, Carole's cousin, assumed really grown-up roles pretty quickly because they had to. And that was kind of that generation. They did not question it. They just did it. It was what they were supposed to do. Sean, if you'll flip to the next slide, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some, again, my focus is on things that maybe aren't talked about a lot. And this is the dangers of non-combat issues. We always think of combat, and obviously it's dangerous, treacherous. Many people are killed and wounded. But what most don't know about was how dangerous training was, how dangerous just transportation was. And these are just a couple of images. I'm going to talk about both of those. One on the right deals with Tom, one on the left is something else I know about from my hometown. But these are some startling statistics I want to read out to you. There's a book that's on just accidents in the United States during World War II, training mission accidents. Over 7,000 planes crashed in training or in transport missions, just transport from that during the war in the United States. Over 15,000 men died in those missions. And that's just training. I guarantee you, if Frank was still alive or had been able to tell stories afterwards, he would have told stories of near misses for himself or others he knew that were killed in accidents. Tom lost his best friend during the war, from high school best friend, who became a P-47 pilot, and he died in an air collision with one of his other pilots on his squadron. Those things were quite common. And one of the things we got to think about is why that would be the case. And there's a lot of different reasons, but one of them is you have a lot of young men who are flying these very expensive, complicated machinery. Tom's 18 or 19, Frank's just a little bit older. That's the age range for these guys. I teach these guys every day. in college now at Liberty University. The thought of my 18 to 22-year-olds or my 19-year-old son flying a B-24 and commanding a crew, I think I'm going to say it's horrifying, as mature and as much as I love them. And that's what they were called to do. But they were still that age group, and they can act impulsively. And some accidents just happen because of the impulsive nature of some of these guys. Quick story about Tom. One day this was in Nevada, they were in the final stages of training. He was with his crew that was going to go to Europe with him. And they'd gone out on a low practice bombing run in the Nevada deserts, but near the mountains. And they're approaching the bombing run, and Tom calls his bombardier, on the radio, and says, we're headed to the target. And the bombardier tells them at that point, I left the bomb sight at home. So he didn't bring the bomb sight on the plane. Tom's furious. Okay, this is that impulsive nature. Now he's already low level, but Tom says, I pushed the throttle full, so got the plane as fast as go, dove to the deck. So he said, I was just feet off the desert, flying. And then he looked up and saw in front of him the mountains. He called it a cul-de-sac in the mountains. And so he flies into this cul-de-sac and he banks as hard as he can. And thankfully for him, they didn't hit the mountains. He swears that he brushed some trees, but he didn't. But there are so many stories about crashes that were pilot error, weather, just all sorts of circumstances. Instrument practice was awful that Carole talked about. And so I want to highlight two of these incidents, these accidents, just to highlight this issue that Tom talked about. The one on the left, this is a crash near my hometown. I grew up in Bedford, Virginia, Central Virginia, near some mountains about 4,000 feet. One of them's called the Peaks of Otter. And in February 1943, a five-man crew and a B-25, this is a 2-engine plane, it's having to look, there's disagreements over exactly what happened. The crew didn't survive, but there were weather and other complications, and it didn't make it over the mountain. It crashed right into the mountain. All five died. Again, one of those 7,000 planes. And that was probably the general conclusion was weather related. The plane on your right is one Tom actually flew. I have a little note, but this was a brand new B-24, had just arrived in Italy. And Tom at this point was one of the veterans at 19 years old, a veteran of about 20 missions. And his commanding officer, this plane was for his commanding officer. That's who's going to fly. But the commanding officer had Tom do a check flight. And so Tom took it out, checked it out. When he lands at San Giovanni Airfield, the front tire blows out. So a mechanical failure, and the plane crashes. It's totaled. Thankfully, Tom, while injured and out of commission for a few weeks, survived this. But these are the things that were common you don't hear about. And not as dangerous as combat, but every pilot, every airman you would talk to from the war would tell you about things like this. They just happen. And, Tom experienced that. To go to the next slide for me, Sean. Here I'm going to tie in a little bit with what Glenn opened up with, and that was conditions. I loved Glenn's picture of them. Looked like they were bailing water against a stream. But this is actually a picture of Tom's tent. So this is about 6 months after Frank had arrived. So the conditions had improved, but it's still a dirt airfield. And the tents, this is Tom's, you can see others in the background. These were, for the officers, these were 4-man tents. The enlisted men slept in a same size tent, but 6 men. And so this was Tom's tent. And they were either set up over a concrete slab, from what Tom said, which was his tent, or sometimes they had a wooden platform. But he arrived in September, late August, early September. He said, then it was incredibly hot, very dusty, so dirty. Then it would rain and be incredibly muddy. We saw those pictures with Glenn. Then in the wintertime, it's very cold and drafty and snowy and icy and slushy, which is really, really terrible conditions. So I set this up to identify some ways our men adapted. And I have a picture there of a 55-gallon aviation drum, steel drum. And Tom talked about this. They used these for heating. So let that sink in. Tom said they had one of these drums literally right outside the tent next to the cot where he slept. And they ran copper wire from a drum like that to the center of the tent where you can see the chimney, where they had modified another drum into a heater. And they had a little clip on the end of the copper tubing that would pinch off the aviation fuel going into their homemade heater. Now, I can't imagine this, and Tom said you just had to get used to it. Aviation fuel flowing, through this wire into your tent, into this, and then lighting it up, and you controlled your temperature that way. But that's what they did. That was crazy. I think only something a 19, 20, or 21-year-old would do, but it served their purpose. They improvised. Now, I'll come back to that heating and cooking device in a minute, but I'm not quite ready. Carole, you mentioned censoring letters and how your cousin Frank's had to censor his own, but the airplane commander was responsible for censoring letters. And so my next little part is unexpected challenges, one challenge, and unexpected joys. So here you go, a 19-year-old guy who's naive to the world. Just keep that in mind. Hasn't had a lot of experience with young ladies, still doesn't know how to ask somebody out very well. And he has to censor the letters of his men who are aged 20 to 30. Several of them are married. Almost all of them have girlfriends. And so I enjoyed thoroughly talking to Tom about this. And he would say how I just would turn beet red reading these letters. And he said, I learned so much about women that I never dreamed of, and I probably didn't want to know from these letters as a 19-year-old. That's an unexpected challenge. So I thought people might enjoy that, but you don't think about that. But that's what this 19-year-old, very grown up. The joys are the two things I have at the bottom. The first, I'm going to actually go to the bottom right, grilled cheese. And I'm sure whoever looked at this first time said, why in the world would I have grilled cheese? Well, the conditions were so awful at San Giovanni Airfield. They did have a mess hall, but it was hard to get to because of the mud and stuff. So they oftentimes ate in their room. Ate in their tent. And so they figured out different things they can cook. And Tom said to this day, he has not been able to duplicate the grilled cheese they would cook on that stove heater in the middle. And so he said the aroma was he just loved them. The other thing, little joy, was the men got beer rations as part of their ration. Well, Tom didn't drink, so he would trade his beer rations to other men to get their ration cards for Hershey almond chocolate. I want to stress the almond chocolate. To this day, that's Tom's favorite candy bar because that's what he got in Italy. So there were unexpected challenges and joys you wouldn't think about when you're waiting for your next mission. And Sean, if you'll go to my last slide, I'm going to close with this slide and spend a minute or a couple minutes on it. One of the great experiences for me with this book, and I think Lynn and Carole could talk to this, is the survivor's guilt that Tom felt after the war. And it's just guilt. Tom flew 28 missions. He was on schedule to complete his missions. If you got to 30, you were sent home. You were rotated home. So that was his goal. It's late February 1945. Again, he's one of the most experienced air commanders in the unit, in the squadron. And they fly a mission to southern Germany. And on the mission, his plane, one of its engines stopped working. So it had mechanical difficulties. But he didn't turn around. He kept going. He could have used that as a reason to turn around and fly back to the base. Over Germany, over Augsburg in the southern part of Germany, another engine was damaged by flak. So his 4-engine plane was reduced to 2 engines. So he's returning home, and he's turning back to Italy. He has a decision to make, and he determines there's no way he can get over the Alps. He can't get the altitude necessary to get back to Italy, get back to base. And so he decides to try to fly to France. France has been recently freed by Allied forces. And so if he could fly, basically head west, he would be in southern Germany, but not that far from France. And so he started heading in that direction, got help from this navigator who was inexperienced at navigating because the main navigator had been pulled to the commander's plane for another mission. So anyway, the navigator gave him some wrong numbers. And so as he's flying, he's actually flying along the border of Germany and Switzerland. And if you ever look at the border, it's kind of up and down about which country you're in. So he was flying in and out of Germany and in and out of Switzerland. And Switzerland's a neutral country. And the Swiss Air Force, if that happens, the Swiss Air Force, by being a neutral, is required to force that plane to land. And so rather than make it to France, Tom had to land in Switzerland. The Swiss Air Force fighter planes came up and they forced him to land. That meant for the remainder of the war, he couldn't serve in Europe. He was interned in Switzerland. Well, why does that matter? Well, there was a stigma associated with flying to Switzerland or to Sweden, which was another neutral country, that some crews did that to get out of future combat missions. They did it deliberately. And they were seen as cowards or letting down. And more, Tom felt he had let his crew down. He had let his unit down. He had let his squadron down. He was actually there only a relatively few days before he was released. He was able to get back to Italy, but when he got back, his squadron was out on the mission, so he didn't see anybody, and then they shipped him back home. So for the next 68 years, 68, I'm not exaggerating, 68 years, he believed that others in his unit thought him a coward or looked down upon him for what he had done. It was so bad he had physical issues with it. Swallowing, he had to have surgery. He just felt guilt for what he had done. The craziness of it all is that a month after little over a month, within 2 months after that last mission, Tom was supposed to be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in April 1945. But that's right at the end of the war, and that was all lost. Nobody got lost in confusion at the end of the war. So he never knew. He was thinking that people thought of him as a coward. And the reality was they saw him as a hero. And it wasn't until 2013, that's the reason the date's up there, that a historian, the guy on the immediate right of Tom in the picture, a friend of Tom's, found this citation that included Tom supposedly getting the Distinguished Flying Cross. And they arranged to have him awarded that in 2013. And Tom said, as soon as I was awarded that, I knew that I hadn't done anything wrong, and his physical symptoms went away. And the guilt he had carried for 68 years went away. Those are the things we don't talk about a lot when we talk about our veterans. And that's one of the things Tom experienced. And so as I close and thank Carole and Glenn for what you do and look forward to what Greg is going to say, there is so much we can learn from our veterans that I appreciate so much what you're doing with the VBC, because it carries on their legacies in ways, unfortunately, not many of them can still do themselves. And so I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Greg.
Thank you very much, David. My father is unable to be here today. He's dealing with the second bout of COVID. He's doing well, and he sends his best, and he's hanging tough. So I talked to him quite a bit over the past couple of days to get his story. And I worked with my sister, Chris. We put together 8 pictures, random pictures, a couple months ago for another purpose. And I didn't know the background or what they were all about. And then when I started talking to my father, I was able to tell his story of World War II in 8 pictures. I'm sure he would love to have more, and he does have more, but it turned out to be a pretty neat activity of learning about his role in World War II. And actually, I had been spending a lot more time working on my grandfather's story. He was in a machine gun battalion in the 3rd Infantry Division in World War I, which I personally found very interesting. And it wasn't until just recently that I really learned about my dad and his role. And so, like Tom's description, my dad came to that point on, where were you on December 7th, 1941? He was a high school senior. He was 17 years old. He didn't turn 18 until late summer after graduation. And he said that several of his classmates on December 8th and 9th ran off to the recruiting centers and were ready to join and go fight for their country. And to a man, their recruiters said, go back to school, finish high school. This war is going to last a little bit of time, and we'll have, you'll serve a better role as a high school graduate than you would if you left right now. And so my dad's experience was he graduated in June of 42 in Detroit from his high school. And he went with one of his best friends to sign up for the Army Air Corps. And he actually was given a sign-in date that was almost a year later. He didn't actually report to get sworn in until he remembered the date very specifically, May 6, 1943. He was told to get to the Civic Opera Building in Chicago for his swearing in. And he met up with guys from generally the Midwest. They all got sworn in, boarded a train and headed off to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. And then his story is a lot like what Carole described. He bounced around the country for all kinds of training. Because he wasn't a college graduate, or even didn't have any college, he had to go to the college training detachment at Iowa State Teachers College for some basic college level math and other skills to sharpen his academic background. He then went to Santa Ana, California to qualify as an aviation candidate. He was pursuing a position as a navigator. And at this point, he wasn't a pilot looking to be downgraded to a navigator. He was a navigator. If he didn't pass, he was going to be an infantryman. And I'd be telling you a story about Battle at Bulge right now instead of 15th Air Force. So I think it worked out well. He had a close call with his depth perception test. The way the test would run is you had two ropes and you had pegs that were 15, 20 feet down the rope. And you had to align them by moving the ropes back and forth and get them within a couple inches of tolerance of one another. And he flunked. And he thought he was going to get washed out and was going to start shining his boots for some infantry basic training. And one of his buddies in the barracks said, don't look at the pegs, look at the sweat marks on the rope. 1,000 guys have used these ropes and look where you line up your hands. And that's exactly where you line them up. So the next day he retook the test, he passed. And he was qualified to become an aviator or a navigator. He continued his training at Ellington Air Force Base with pre-flight, aerial gunnery in Laredo, navigator school at San Marcos. And then he was commissioned on June 10th, 1944. He was 19 years old into the Army Air Corps. And so a key date, that's 4 days after D-Day, after the Normandy invasion. And so his experiences in 1944 and 45 are very different from the experiences of people that showed up earlier in the war, even 43, or even earlier 44. So it was a different environment. So the experiences I'll talk about were his experiences at that time as a 19-year-old navigator. He was assigned to the 723rd Bomb Squadron, 450th Bomb Group, 15th Air Force, in Manduria, Italy. And he completed his combat missions before his 21st birthday. They say 50 missions, but I agree with David. I don't think anybody did 50 missions. I think he said they did 35 to 40, and they called it 50 missions. And that's when you get your ticket to go home. As a navigator, navigators tended to be in short supply in his squadron. So he would go from his crew to another crew, and he ended up racking up combat missions in much quicker succession than the rest of his crew. And so he got to leave a little bit earlier than the others did. This picture here is from the summer of 44. He had just completed his commissioning. He's in Dearborn, Michigan. He went home to sort of celebrate with a bunch of his buddies. And when he got home, he realized all his buddies were in the service too, and there was nobody to celebrate with. So he was home with his family, which was nice. But he's a 19-year-old, and he's about to head off to war. Next slide, please.
If you hear crying in the background, it's just my dog.
Okay. This is the summer of 44, and My father is back row, second from the left. And this is in Gowan Field in Boise, Idaho. They formed his crew in Boise, Idaho at Gowan Field and conducted operational training as they were preparing to head off to war. So the back row are the officers, bombardier, navigator, co-pilot, and pilot. The front row, non-commissioned officers, you got a nose gunner, radio operator, waist gunner, engineer, ball turret gunner, and tail gunner. And because there are 6 gun positions on a B-24, the radio operator would also generally serve as a waist gunner, and the engineer would serve as the top turret gunner, had close proximity to those positions. Once formed into a crew, they conducted their operational training for several weeks, and then from Idaho, they were given orders to report to Newport News, where they would ship out for Europe. And my dad took a delay en route, went back to Dearborn, and had a couple of days of leave time. That's where he met my mom. They had 2 dates before he had to head off to Newport News, and they said that they'd stay in touch. So travel across the ocean in a convoy of ships took 26 days. There were still threats across the Atlantic, although it wasn't nearly as bad as it had been in the previous years or even earlier that year. And they, as a crew, arrived in Naples, Italy in mid-October 1944 and were assigned to the 723rd Bomb Squadron. Next slide, there you go. This is from late 44, early 45. The B-24s are flying in formation over southern Italy. Probably those are olive groves. He said wherever he stepped in Manduria, he was stepping on olives. And I'll show you that on a map in just a few moments. My father flew his first mission in early November of 44 and his final mission in 45. He said typically a formation of B-24s of his squadron would consist of 7 B-24s in tight formation, and they'd be joined with 7 aircraft from each of the other squadrons. His near-miss experience, as David was describing, was they were returning from an operational mission, and all of a sudden, his squadron of B-24s was flying through a squadron of B-17s. He said he could have reached out and touched some of those planes. They were that close. They came incredibly close to every one of those aircraft having a head-on collision with a B-17, which obviously would have been disastrous. He said somebody made a major mistake, either in the planning or whatever route they were taking, but not a single aircraft was damaged or lost in that. He said his payload was typically 500-pound, 250-pound high explosive bombs, and the total payload was often a trade-off between the type target, the distance to the target, and the need for fuel. So they would balance those things and make sure they had enough fuel to get there and back, and provide the necessary payload to attack the target. Flight speed and altitude. He said typically their flight speed was pushing 300 miles an hour, but typically they would cruise about 180 miles an hour and often flew at 18,000 to 22,000 feet. So they needed oxygen, obviously, to fly in. It was also freezing at that altitude. And one of the challenges, again, one of the mishaps that often happened to them was their condensation in their oxygen tubes would accumulate just below the face mask and would freeze. And if you weren't paying attention, you could quickly pass out and not even know it. And so he told one time in particular, the bombardier saw him turn in a couple of different shades of colors he wasn't meant to be. And he just grabbed his oxygen tube, cracked up the ice in it, and he was able to catch his breath and continue on. Their bombing missions were all in daylight. He said that they had tested some single ships, some single aircraft flying night missions, but they realized that the risk was just too high. So they flew daytime missions and tight formations, dropped their bomb on the lead's command, And so generally, the bombardier in every aircraft other than the lead was sort of optional. My dad as a navigator would often be the one dropping the bombs because all you're doing is following what the lead aircraft was doing. They made their run, dropped their bombs, and moved out. They said one pass and haul your rear end. So they didn't stick around or make re-engagements of any of their targets. Missions tended to last about 8 hours duration. So from Manduria, they'd fly across north along the Adriatic Sea, cross the Alps. He said majority of his targets were Munich and Vienna. And the return, the mission out and back was tend to be about 8 hours in duration. But because of some other closer targets, sometimes as short as 6, sometimes as long as 10 hours. Also, like David had described with Tom's experience, my father did not have any serious problems with enemy aircraft as they were making their operational or their bombing runs. He said most of their challenge came from enemy aircraft fire from the ground, specifically around Munich and Vienna. But very light fighter activity in 44 and 45. Here's the map that we talked about a little while ago. My father with the 450th Bomb Group was in Manduria, down there in the heel of the boot of Italy. He seemed to, he mentioned Fojia. I don't think he'd ever been there, but he said also that Barry was the site of the headquarters of the 15th Air Force. But his life centered around Manduria. His targets would generally focus on infrastructure. I call them infrastructures, oil refineries, rail bridges, rail yards, marshalling yards, perhaps sometimes airfields. They'd also sometimes go after targets in Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Italy. Next slide, please. As an Army guy, I always sort of chuckle at this picture of an officers club at the air base during World War II, but the Cottontail Club was an officers club. And my father is the one on the right with his bombardier, Earl Zellner, to his left, and on the left side of the picture. And this was in Manduria, Italy. They had pretty rough conditions when they got there. They hired a bunch of locals to pour cement, concrete to shore up their tents and have some solid ground and eliminate some of the mud that they had to deal with. And that late in the war, they had some of those options to improve their living conditions a bit from some of the other pictures we had seen. Next slide, please. I spent my entire life thinking my dad flew in the Swamp Rat. Matter of fact, when I had a Bradley fighting vehicle, I called it the Swamp Rat, and out of respect for my dad. Come to find out, and I learned this last week, he was on one of those missions here where he was pulled from his crew to go provide a navigator for the Swamp Rat that needed him to round out the crew. I also found out the Swamp Rat wasn't a rat, it was a dog. And so if you can see at the very bottom of the picture, they're all snuggling around a couple of dogs. So I learned that, and it's on me. The key thing about this, go back to that one, please.
Oh, sorry.
The key thing about this picture is nose art was artwork in the Air Force, and there are books written about the nose art of bombers and the like. So he was a Swamp Rat, and this aircraft had been a workhorse. The bombs on the side of the aircraft indicate bombing missions that aircraft had been part of. And so my dad's head sort of blocks the fourth row, but there were at least 77, maybe 78 bombing missions that this aircraft went on. Plus you got the 4 swastikas behind the word Swamp Rat. Those indicate fighter aircraft that that particular B-24 was credited with shooting down. Next slide. You can't see it really well, but this aircraft is called Bottoms Up. And when I showed my dad this picture the other day, boy, he just sat up in his seat And he started saying, March 1945, I remember this operation. He was just rattling off what happened in this operation. And it's really a sad story. But it was March 1945. They were flying in formation. And my father tells the story that his aircraft for this mission was the lead aircraft in the squadron taking off. Bottoms up was second, took off behind them. And they caught up into formation. The third plane lost an engine on takeoff, exploded on the ground, and some of the crew members were escaped. Others were killed in the explosion. And I'm led to believe that on the same mission as they were flying back, my dad's aircraft and Bottoms Up were flying side by side in formation. They entered a cloud, and my dad's airplane came out. Bottoms Up never came out, and it was just missing in action. Nobody knows what happened to it to this day. There's no indication there was any kind of enemy activity or whatever else. It perhaps landed in the Adriatic Sea and was never found. About 20 years ago, my dad was at one of his reunions and met this gentleman who said that a close relative of his was on the Bottoms Up, and he had made it a life mission to try to figure out what happened to it, and had not been able to determine what that was. He flew his final mission in April 1945. He departed his unit and waited to catch a ship back to the States, perhaps back to Naples to catch that ship. And so he was on a ship heading back through the Mediterranean, and he was passing through the Straits of Gibraltar when he got word of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, on May 8th, 1945. So his trip to Europe took 26 days, as I said. His return trip took 5 days. Perhaps it was a single ship. They weren't in a convoy. It was not the kind of threat they had previously. But he was on orders to Texas, or first California, then Texas, for transition training, because in May of 1945, the war in the Pacific was still raging, and there was talk about a possible invasion of the Japanese mainland. So he was on orders to transition training for another aircraft and duty in the Pacific theater. So as he was heading back to the States, that was his expectation. Next slide, please. I told you he met my mom on his way to Europe. And on the way back, they met up again. They dated 29 times in 30 days. And my dad said goodbye again and headed off to Santa Ana for his transition training. They got married 3 years later in 1948. And I asked my dad about wearing a uniform while on leave. And he said that's what was done. He said there was never any other real option. They just wore it. And Glenn and I were chuckling the other day that it was probably also a great way to pick up girls. So wearing a uniform, something that would have been foreign to me in my time in the service, but certainly during World War II, they wore their uniform. And next slide, please. This picture here signifies post-war. My dad in this picture was on his way to New York to meet up with the high school buddy he enlisted with a couple of years prior. And he stopped by Bayonne, New Jersey to see his cousin who owned a grocery store there. And this also shows another uniform combination that they wore. Essentially, he had pinks and greens, which ironically is now the current uniform the Army wears. They're back to the World War II pinks and greens, khakis, and the dark green and combinations thereof, but looks pretty sharp in this particular picture. So to wrap up his experience in World War II, he was at Ellington Air Force Base in Houston, Texas in August 1945. He was trained on another aircraft for anticipated deployment to the Pacific Theater. We dropped the bombs over Japan, and VJ Day was celebrated August 14th.
Okay.
And 2 days later, he turned 21. So getting back to David's point, the expectation of young men filling big roles, big responsibilities And we have great examples here today of people who answer the call.
These are just three incredibly fascinating, compelling examples of these young men who fought their way through World War II, in this case, through the 15th Air Force. Obviously, there are literally millions and millions of stories like this. So first, let me thank each one of our three presenters today. David Snead, Carole Popchock, and John Bozek each did fantastic jobs conveying your loved ones. I know David, not family, but still loved, I'm sure, stories. Okay. So I see Connor has his hand up. We run a little bit.
Right before we get to Connor, there was one question on Facebook, and that was from Jeff Ballard, who did have to drop off.
Okay.
1 second. He asked, why was the 15th so B-24 heavy compared to the 8th? And he also that his great uncle, Captain Lloyd A. Starkweather, was a navigator with the 97th BG. Lloyd flew 50 missions after arriving in North Africa on May 27, 1943, and departing Manfrednia near Fojia on February 4th, 1944. I might be mispronouncing that. Mission 50, submarine pens at Toulon, France. But the question, why was the 15th so B-24 heavy compared to the 8th?
Well, first of all, David, do you know, is that a fact?
The answer is I have no idea.
Yeah,
I have no idea. I had never sat down to compare the numbers, B-17 versus B-24, so I don't know why that worked out the way. In the end, more B-24s were manufactured, so it could be just based on that.
Beth Ruschel did mention here in the chat that there's a historian of the 15th on here. CPAR is the 461st unit historian. CPAR is what you have as your name. I don't know if you would like to unmute and if you have an answer for that question. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Okay, great. I don't know if I have a great answer for why the 15th was B-24 heavy, but I can tell you there were 15 B-24 groups and 6 B-17 groups. And a large number of B-24s were sent from the 8th to the 15th as the 8th Air Force was transitioning away from B-24s. I don't know what the logic was for it, except I knew a number of people thought B-17s were better planes. Not an opinion I tend to share, but that's the way it worked out. And the B-24, I think, served itself very well flying in Southern Europe and the distances that some of them had to fly. I think the plane took a lot more damage than a lot of people give it credit for. But I don't have an honest answer for you why the upper managements, shall we say, actually decided to transition the 8th Air Force to B-17s. And they kept B-24s as well, so they didn't get rid of all of them.
Thank you.
Sean, could I add one observation there? One thing I learned from reading up on the 15th Air Force was that the B-24 kept getting adapted. Whatever wasn't working in combat, they would take it back to the factory, they'd change some things, and they would improve it. The B-24 kept getting improved throughout the course of the war. I don't know if that suggests that maybe it was a more adaptable plane than the B-17. I have no idea, but I did notice that as I was reading about the exploits of the 15th. For example, the addition of the top turret over the pilot's station on the plane.
I could offer one explanation of that point, Carole. You know, B-24s were almost all, I think, the great majority of them made at the famous Ford factory up in Michigan, right? I can't remember the name of that factory right now. But say again?
Willow Run.
Willow Run, yeah. Mm-hmm. And, you know, B-17s were first manufactured in 1934, 35, prototypes, and then gradually, you know, more and more. B-24s first manufactured, help me to be sure, 41, 42. There's a great book by, I think it's Paul Kennedy, about Willow Run and the issues they had in the production side of that. I mean, this a little bit like the B-29, which was rushed into production. And, you know, the prototypes were just to try to keep up with the problems they were having. Right.
Greg Yost added in the comments a B-24 Heavy, 1, later manufacturing date, 2, B-24 had a longer range. Trey, I see your hands up, and I assume that you might have some information on this as well.
Yes, I do. Quite a lot, actually. I actually am very interested in the B-24. It's one of my favorite planes, not because of any specific reason that I like it, just because it has such an interesting history about it. It's one of those planes that you either really love or hate, and it depends on like what one you were handed, if you were a pilot, like what your definition of a heavy bomber is. And one of the reasons why I think the 15th was a bit more a B-24 heavy is it was just less of a priority than the 8th. And that's not me saying anything about the 15th or the 8th. That's just a statement. There were more bombers and more funds heading towards the 8th than there were the 15th. The 15th would have been given B-24s because it was the largest, it was the most produced, I believe the most produced aircraft of the war. I'm not sure. It might have been passed by IL-2 Sturmovik, a Russian ground attack aircraft, but it was up there. It's like either the first or the second spot. So we just had a ton of them. The Pacific, B-24s everywhere. You saw B-17s in the Pacific, but the majority of planes were B-24s because we just had so many of them. So I just, again, like we lend-lease B-24s to all our other nations. We really kept B-17s kind of for ourselves and for specific high priority targets because B-17s were expensive. They were expensive. They were not easy to produce, and they were a bit more vulnerable than the B-24, although that's kind of debated. That's a bit controversial. But the main way the B-24 worked is basically you would build one, you'd build 10 of them, and then you'd all just send them out, kind of like the B-17. But the B-17 was a lot more survivable, like I already said. And the way was like, again, it was more expensive. And you could see this over time that it got upgraded a lot. And not in the way the B-24 was upgraded due to versatility. It was upgraded just so that it could keep surviving. It was a very high priority aircraft. And a lot of people really forget that about the aircraft of World War II, is that the B-17 isn't a pile of junk. It's an expensive plane. It's big. It has that heavier bomb load. It has a large range. The B-24 has a bit less, but it is a lot. It is a lot cheaper to make. It's a lot easier. And I think that's the reason. And that's just the reason I've talked about before in the Pacific, but that's the reason I'm thinking, although I'm not certain, because I'm not a huge, I don't have a huge amount of knowledge on the World War II bomber front, but I have a bit. So that's just what I'm going on.
Thank you very much, Trey. There are a couple other hands raised, Sean.
Yeah, definitely. And I hope that this answers Jeff Ballard's question. And if it doesn't, send us an email or a comment. You can email Todd or I. And last up here, Connor, you had a story that you wanted to add for this evening's program.
Well, first, I have a couple stories I'd like to share. First of all, this program reminds me of my own great-grandfather, who inspired me to interview all these veterans from World War II. He was not in the 15th, he was 8th Air Force, who was under Doolittle. He had a lot of respect for Doolittle. And I have to tell one story who I have not told. This was in Normandy on D-Day. This was just before an invasion of Normandy. And he was assigned to the base commander, Colonel Stevens, to go to Normandy to see what was happening. It was supposed to be June 5th, but they had to cancel that because of bad weather, which we all know in history books. Mm-hmm. And let's see. his colonel told him to move closer, and he said, what's he said, well, sir, I have flown my last mission yesterday, so if you want to get closer, you have to get another pilot because I'm not taking that risk. That's one of the stories that Pops has told. The other one was this Baltic gunner who I've told this story numerous amount of times, that his Baltic gunner, he will not let his Baltic gunner go to the bathroom because enemy territory with the Germans. So the Baltic gunner had no choice but to accidentally wet his pants and got the Purple Heart fur from frostbite in his wiener.
Thank you, Connor. And I'll give you one more story only because we're overtime for tonight.
Yes, the most recent interview I've interviewed was, he's my second oldest veteran I've interviewed. He's 104 years old. His name is Francis Newcomber Jr. He's very interesting because he was born in Washington Barracks, because his dad was an engineer officer in World War I, served over in France, and stayed in the service. And one of his, before the war, that's where he met his mother, and that's when Francis was born. And like his dad stayed in the service, so he grew up, which is what we call an army brat, because he was Army engineers. And he went to West Point in 1935 and was with the class in 1939. His father was West Point in 1913, and he was World War I and World War II. And he had an uncle that was killed in World War II, and he was class in 1919 as a colonel. And his grandfather was class of 1886. So, and his cousin was classmates with his own cousin, who was a brigadier general later on. He was an aviator, class in 1939. And most of his classmates, so he grew up in a very interesting background with classmates who were superior in rank, that were mostly general officers. One of them was Andrew Goodpasture. I don't know if you heard the name. He was a battalion commander in North Africa, and he was in Italy. And he was superintendent of West Point in military academy. And then he was a 4-star general and supreme commander of NATO under President Eisenhower. And so Francis had several various assignments. One of them, he was a battery man. So he was on watch when the naval ships were removed from the Atlantic and the Pacific after Pearl Harbor happened. And he was on that watch from Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean for the removal of some of the naval ships that were at Pearl Harbor at the time. And then he was on Admiral Mountbatten's staff as a staff officer, and he was executive officer to Major General Horace Fuller. And
all right,
CBI.
I'm going to pause you right there, Connor. Let's that will be our part one of his story, and hold for part two. Only because we're over time for tonight. We want to thank our guests. Glenn, do you want to take us out? Connor, make sure you hold on to that story for part two.
Just let me ask. I see one other hand raised. Beth, do you have something quick you wanted to volunteer for us?
I just wanted to say thank you for focusing on the 15th Air Force tonight. I was so excited when I saw that you guys were doing this because, as Chuck knows, my grandpa was in the 15th Air Force. He's the short one over here. He was a tail gunner on a B-24. So I'm just always in awe of, I just love learning about it. And I'm just really excited that you guys focused on him, because a lot of people just focus on the 8th and only the 8th. So thank you.
Oh, okay, our pleasure. Listen, this has been a great pleasure tonight to focus on the 15th Air Force. Mr. Parr, I sent you my email address in the chat room. Could I ask you to email me, please? gflickinger@tabpittsburgh.com. And then let me once more thank our three guests tonight, Dr. David Snead, Carole Popchock, and Greg Bozek. Thank you very, very much. Each of the stories were compelling and made for a great evening. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night. We'll see you